Trans and non-binary people make up less than 1% of the US population. So why are we being targeted by the government?
Trans vaccine would not let my daughter live. I support transgender. The FBI and the Heritage Administration is taking trans without civic. Trans people. What is remember? But you know there's image.
As of this year, 2.8 million people in the US identify as trans, which comes out to about 0.8% of the entire population. That is less than 1% of the population, yet trans people are consistently targeted by laws, they're the victims of harassment, and they're generally made to be at the center of various political issues over the past few years. Most of the time, we just want to exist peacefully, so how did we end up here? To understand why trans people are being targeted in the US in 2025, we have to go back to what fascism means. For the record, we are not currently in a fully fascist regime, but our current government definitely has elements of fascism in it. The definition of fascism is you have a dictator or some sort of dictatorial figure at the head of the government. And you have this idea that the interests of the nation or of a specific race are more important than the interests of an individual. So it's not a government for the good of the common people, but rather the people are working together for the good of the nation. There's this idea of nationalism that underlies fascism. And there's also this idea of national regeneration or rebirth. This idea that things have gotten so far off from the fascist nationalist ideal that some violence might be necessary to bring us back to that regeneration, to bring us back to the kind of ideal state that they have pictured. What this leads to historically is that you have this one group at the center, and then you have other groups that are demonized. You have this opposition to or violence against this group of others. A lot of times it's because this dictator has a specific idea of what nation or what race is most important or is chosen in some way, and so those who go against that are a good target for sort of the hatred and violence that oftentimes comes with nationalism. In Italy, under Mussolini, you had Slavic people as the target. In Germany, under Hitler, you had Jewish people as the target. In the US, which does feature many of those qualities of fascism that I just talked about, you have immigrants and trans people as the demonized groups. I know a lot of my audience is younger, and I'm fairly young myself, so it's important to remember that LGBTQ plus rights are fairly recent in the United States. There is a much longer history of discrimination and at times violence against people of the LGBTQ plus community, and the freedom that a lot of us have is only because of opposition over decades that has led to just really the past 10, 20 years of freedom and rights. It was only in 2003, a little over 20 years ago, that the Supreme Court first held up same-sex relationships as lawful. And gay marriage only became federally legal in 2015, 10 years ago. In 2014, Obama outlawed discrimination on the basis of gender in the workplace, so 10 years ago, things were generally moving in the right direction. In 2015, 60% of Americans supported same-sex marriage. By 2022, that number had gone up to 74%. But now it's back down to 66%. We're kind of starting to move back in the wrong direction. But trans people have often faced even more discrimination. There was a recent survey in the LA Times in 2024 that found that 80% of Americans support lesbian, gay, and bisexual people living in a way that makes them happy, but only 67% of those respondents supported trans people having the same rights. Trans people tend to have less visibility, and so there becomes more of this narrative that it's somehow unnatural, or sometimes that is a social phenomenon. Right-wing lawmakers, right-wing media have taken advantage of that in a lot of ways. The first Trump administration, starting in 2017, rolled back a lot of protections for transgender people that were recently put into place. Things surrounding just using the correct bathroom, playing on sports teams that align with your actual gender, and getting access to gender-affirming healthcare were all rolled back by the Trump administration. But at the same time, there was also this social narrative that started to be constructed. In 2018, there was a study published that posited the existence of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which was defined to be gender dysphoria in the context of peer pressure or social situations, not gender dysphoria as being something inherent or something that you're born with. The study was disproved, but it did get some traction, especially among lawmakers, and just furthered this narrative that being trans was not natural or innate. And then social media took that and spread the fire even further. You kind of had two things happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. On the one side, you had more people recognizing their identity as gender nonconforming or trans. I think this is because gender is inherently linked to social norms that we have created around what it means to be feminine or masculine. So during the pandemic, when everybody had to stay inside, meetings were on Zoom, school was on Zoom, a lot of those norms started to just look nonsense or be totally stripped away. And people were also just spending more time online on social media, so you had more people learning about what it meant to be transgender or non-binary or gender non-conforming in general. And I think those factors are the primary reasons why you have more young people who are coming out as transgender compared to adults. The percentage of US youth who are transgender is 3.3% versus less than 1% for adults. So there was a positive outcome to social media and the pandemic in helping more people realize their identity. But then on the flip side, you had more people who were able to spread lies and fearmonger about being transgender. And one of those big fearmongering accounts was Libs of TikTok. Starting in 2021, that account started to spread lies about gender-affirming care for youth and calling gender-affirming care grooming and just creating this fear-mongering idea that people, and kids specifically, were being put into these life-altering situations in ways that were harmful to them, instead of looking at the reality, which is that kids who are transgender need access to healthcare. And this account also made being transgender and getting this gender-affirming care seem much more of a trend than it actually is when we look at the survey data on how many people identify as transgender. And then you had Libs of TikTok going on traditional media like television and interviews, continuing to spread these rumors. And so then you have traditional news sources picking it up and feeding it to older Republicans who are then taking it as this social contagion of grooming and transgender care being pushed on people who aren't actually transgender. As we know, people care more about narrative and what they want to believe than about truth. And that narrative was out there and it started to build. Republicans could point to this as something to be worried about, worrying about the safety of our kids and just stoking that anti-trans sentiment. And that's part of what Trump campaigned on for his second term. And that's where a lot of the dangers started to come into play. Because all of those laws against trans people that were discriminatory combined with this idea that it was grooming and hurting kids specifically into this idea that being trans and the transgender population in the US were somehow harmful and dangerous. So in other words, it was the perfect target for fascists. The second Trump administration has had a very different tone and rhetoric from the first. It felt like Trump was testing the waters, seeing what he and the administration could get away with. And now under the second Trump administration, a lot of that hate has become more explicit, a lot more of Trump signing executive orders and doing things directly instead of going through political channels. All of these are moves that are closer to fascism, and unfortunately, trans people are one of the victims of that shift. Under the second, there has been basically an all-out attack on trans people as an entire group. Day one in office, Trump signed an executive order completely denying the existence of transgender and non-binary gender identities, alleging that there are only two gender identities which align with two recognized sexes, male and female. Not only does this totally negate the existence of intersex people, but it also wiped out those non-conforming gender identities from government recognition altogether. And so just as quickly as transgender people started to see more acceptance and visibility under the Biden administration, those rights and that equality has been taken away and in fact is reverting to much worse than it was previously. As an example, gender nonconforming people were only able to self-determine male, female, or X gender markers on their passport for 3 years, 2022 to 2025, when the executive order was signed. So this has meant that not only is there a public, very visible attack on trans people coming from the government of this country, but also many trans people have lost rights to healthcare, to gender-affirming, life-saving care, especially trans youth, and to other components of visibility and equality within society. In many ways, this feels like only the beginning because the government continues to push this narrative that trans people are somehow dangerous or even deranged. As an example, there's this current anti-trans rhetoric petitioning the FBI to label trans people as a whole nihilistic, violent extremists. And the context in which this keeps coming up is around shootings, because there was a shooting at a Minneapolis Catholic school and the shooter was trans. So now that narrative has conveniently become a right-wing talking point. And whenever other shootings occur, right-wing commentators are quickly looking for opportunities to push this narrative that trans people are somehow dangerous. And the scary part about all of this is that the facts don't matter. Less than 0.1% of mass shooters since 2013 have been transgender individuals, with the vast majority, 97.5%, being cisgender males. But the media and the political pundits do not care about the facts, and that's what's so scary. You have Donald Trump going on air talking about how they're experimenting with mice undergoing transgender surgeries, which was just completely false, but that narrative got picked up and just continues to push this anti-trans sentiment. This is exactly what we see under fascism. The facts don't matter. It doesn't matter that most trans people are non-violent, non-harmful, and just want to exist. It doesn't matter that trans people are statistically a less dangerous group than cisgender males, because the narrative is out there. And trans people are such a minority in this country that it's a convenient other, a convenient enemy to portray. And I think the scariest part is we've already seen what this administration is trying to do to groups it considers other by its treatment of immigrants over the past few months. And I don't say that with the goal of scaring you, but I think the current narrative and reality against trans people in the United States is scary. And as someone who's to consider not only my own safety, but also the safety of my wife and my kids, the idea that my identity might in some way negatively affect our family is terrifying. So trans and non-binary people are being unfairly and unjustly targeted, and there's not a lot we can do about it because we're such a small percentage of the population. So what can we do? I think each of us has 3 options, and there's no right or wrong answer to the way we go about existing under the current administration. The options are to leave, to go to a different country that recognizes trans people and non-binary people as equal to everyone else, and to hide, to not be public about your identity, to potentially detransition or just be less visibly gender non-conforming, or to fight back, whatever that might look like for you. I'm in a place of relative safety. I live in a city that is predominantly Democrat and is actually one of the most liberal in terms of support for transgender and gender nonconforming people. So it's actually a city where a lot of people who aren't safe, especially over the border in Texas, come to when they need more freedom or access to care. And I have safety and a support system. I've talked about this with my wife and with my family, and we're all scared that it might have some effect on the kids, but at the end of the day, we live in a place of enough privilege and safety that I can continue to speak up and be open about my identity. That's it. I don't have a ton of hope to share. Of course, administrations come and go, but even beyond the next few years, it's going to take a long time to roll back not only the legislation and the lack of access to healthcare, but also the public perception against trans people that have been created over the past few years. But ultimately, visibility and continued bravery on the part of people who are gender nonconforming and trans is the only way that we're going to ever get enough visibility and enough power to take those things back. At the end of the day, I am encouraged that more young people feel comfortable to come out as themselves, because that means that even in the face of all of this adversity, more and more kids who are part of the community are understanding who they are and being comfortable in their own identities, even if the world is making it harder for them to live as themselves. It's scary out there. I'm not going to change, and I'll keep declaring my identity as many times as I have to.